It's a pleasure to once again be convening for the Walt Fisher Lecture. For those of you who are new and hopefully will be joining us in the fall, a few years back we inaugurated an annual lecture in honor of Walt Fisher, who is an extremely distinguished, and I would say more except he's sitting there, extremely distinguished colleague, former colleague, who was part of the Department of Communication in the College of Letters, Arts, and Science that was merged with the Annenberg School a while back, certainly before my time. But when Walt retired, it seemed appropriate to honor him, and to honor him in a way that was, I think, particularly appropriate, which was an annual lecture where we bring back one of our doctoral alumni to talk about their work, their interest, and to, in effect, demonstrate to all of us here that there are such illustrious careers awaiting all of our doctoral students who, someday in the future will be back here speaking. So this is I think, a particularly appropriate kind of event for a graduate school to have, and I think Walt Fisher is a particularly appropriate person to be named and honored by that. I'm very happy to welcome today Susan Herbst, and I will in a moment ask Peter Clark to introduce her, someone who has known her in ways that I certainly can't, having been here as her teacher. But I've known Susan since she was a graduate student. I was in the other body at the time, but I have really enjoyed knowing Susan, reading her, but also talking with her and meeting with her over many years. So it's really a great pleasure for me to have her come back here and speak to us tonight. So I'd like to ask Peter to do the formal introduction.
Thanks, Larry. Before introducing our speaker tonight, I want to add my voice of recognition and honor for Walt Fisher, who is now Professor Emeritus, but for decades was really a distinguished member of the University of Southern California faculty. And among the several writings of Walt that I continue to treasure and use, I think his development of what's called the narrative paradigm is something that I keep returning to, and I'd like to urge those of you who are new students in communication to go to school on that, because it's a very rich vein of ore that Walt developed. And you could do a lot worse than start with the Wikipedia entry for the narrative paradigm, which will introduce you to a number of his papers, and particularly in the 1990s, and then his seminal book, Human Communication as Narration, which continues to be treasured in the discipline of communication internationally as really a quite original voice. So we're very honored to recognize once again the contributions that Walt has made to the discipline, to this university, and to hundreds and hundreds of students who remember him fondly. And for those of you who may not single him out automatically by appearance, I'd like to ask Walt to stand so you can recognize him. More than 20 years ago, when Susan was a student at USC, was really a different age in terms of media technologies. We didn't have websites then. Programs had catalogs. This is an arcane and archaic vehicle of communication, but and so those the younger among you in the room will not even recognize what a catalog might be, but this is what one looks like. And I brought it along this evening as a bona fides that we even recognize Susan's talents while she was a student here, because the leitmotif of this particular catalog for the Annenberg School is that it features recent graduates of the school, not the faculty, but pictures and little bios and vignettes of recent graduates. And what became of them? What was their first job on finishing their master's in communication management? What was their first job on finishing the Ph.D. in communication? And Susan was pictured on page 8. And her first job was assistant professor at Northwestern University. Not bad. That also affirms our prescience in understanding her quality of mind. She, of course, has had a meteoric career as a university administrator. She's been successively an assistant dean, a dean, a provost, an executive vice president of this, a chancellor of that, in a number of universities, Northwestern, Temple, SUNY Buffalo, and a very distinguished position with the entire higher education system in the state of Georgia. And as most of you know, she has recently been appointed as the 15th president of the University of Connecticut. But we have not brought her back because of her meteoric rise through the ranks of university administration. We brought her back because of the quality of her mind and because of the rich and rewarding trail of writing about public discourse that we owe to her. My favorite of her several books and papers has for a long time been Reading Public Opinion. But I think with the publication of her new work just last year, Rude Democracy, aptly named, I might say, I may shift my allegiance to it. I won't try and sketch the range of her mind or the topics that she's addressed because I don't want to preempt what she's chosen to talk with us about this evening, but I'm sure that it will be rewarding and provocative to us all, and I want to welcome back to Annenberg and to USC Susan Herbst.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fisher. It's such an honor to be giving this lecture with you here, and I'm so incredibly grateful for all the years you gave USC. I'm sorry I didn't take your class, but we were divided back then. But I took Randy Lake's class, and he got us through Cassirer and all this very hard stuff, and grateful for that. And Peter and Janet and Susan and Peter, it's so great to see you here. It's wonderful to be on campus. It's a pleasure to watch USC grow and Annenberg grow since 1989 when I left. I had a very idyllic graduate student experience. I was talking to some of the current students, and they said it's still pretty idyllic, but we didn't work that much. You know, we didn't have to TA or we did have to RA, but it was for Jim Benniger, so it involved having lunch at the faculty club most of the time, and writing crazy things on napkins, which we then tried to decipher to be our dissertation. And but it was a great time, and I wish Jim were here today. My graduate advisor, he was a brilliant guy. I know that if he were here, he'd embarrass me, and humiliate me somehow, but always in that Jim-like way that was such a pleasure. And I know he'd be incredibly proud to work with you, Larry, because he thought so much of you and admired you very much. So I have a kind of a formal talk, and I hope that's okay. I'm from the East Coast. I have no PowerPoint or anything like that, just a straight-up talk and about civility, about the topic of my new book. And I've long been interested in the stickier topics of democratic theory and practice. It makes scholarly life very interesting, but also frustrating. And public opinion, as Peter mentioned, is a concept that I've been interested in since I left Annenberg. And it's a concept that becomes increasingly more complicated with every passing year and new technology that emerges. And I put civility in that category as well. It's a crucial, central topic in democratic theory and practice, but it's very aggravating. It's very slippery, very elusive. In any case, and like public opinion, though, it just won't go away as a concept, as an idea. So I think we have to confront the nature of civility and incivility, think about its place in our political lives if we're going to be citizens and participants and leaders. Beyond democratic theory, communication research, and political science, though, I wrote the book on civility. It started because of my students that I've worked with over the decades, back at Northwestern and then the different universities I've been at. A few years ago, I'd been working with one of our state legislators in Georgia, and he was worried about free speech on campus and whether students could really talk about politics candidly in the classroom and what their experience was like as sort of political actors. So we did a survey 2 years in a row of a couple of thousand students across the state of Georgia, randomly selected and did everything right to figure out whether students felt comfortable expressing themselves on campus or in the classroom in terms of expressing their political opinions, their social opinions. And what we found was very surprising to me, at least. The faculty were not an issue. I mean, there were many comments about faculty, but there were kind of sort of typical comments and complaints that students have. So nothing unusual there. But many, many students. I mean, it was overwhelming. The qualitative data, especially, expressed a profound discomfort in talking about politics, religion, important social issues with each other. They were worried about getting in a fight, about being passionate where it's not welcome, concerned about saying something offensive, or just about getting upset. The most important takeaway was that students don't feel good about political argument. In fact, they like to avoid it at all costs because they think it can lead to incivility, to disruption, to unhappiness. So, I found this very troubling, but it rang true. And then, I wondered, was I any good at making arguments in college? Did I ever seek out people who had different opinions than I did? Did I ever change my mind? But taking it up a few levels to a grander stage, does America know how to argue in a civil, productive fashion? And I think the answer is a resounding no. Hence our current political discourse. It's mostly flip and hysterical, annoying, and feels dangerous at times. So those are the kind of factors that led to me to writing the book. And again, the student survey kind of set me off. Now, there's incivility around us every day. And I'm not going to talk about, I often get calls about this, could I talk about manners and social rudeness? Like, people think I'm an expert in that. I'm not a sociologist. So I'm not going to talk about any of that, like when somebody takes your parking space, and it was clear that you had your blinker on, or gives you the finger in traffic, which I get a lot. And my husband says it's me. It's not the incivility all around me. It's my driving. But those are social manners. They're very important. They're very interesting, but less interesting to me because I work on political discourse, how we talk, how we tolerate each other's beliefs, and whether it goes anywhere productive with regard to public policy and life in America. So let me talk about three aspects of political civility today, then about public opinion, which is my real field. I'm more of a visitor in the civility literature, which is very interesting, but it's a lot to learn. First, and I'll talk about very briefly, is civility in American politics and American history. So get some context. Have we really hit rock bottom in 2011? Where have we been as a nation with regard to civility? Second, I wanted to talk about the balance between civility and incivility. Maybe some incivility is good. Maybe it's helpful. It's hard to think about this, but maybe we just need a tougher skin as American citizens. We never really developed it. Third, I'll talk about how we might boost civility, particularly through schools and colleges, places that still have powerful effects on shaping us as citizens. And then I'll talk about what it all means, if anything, with regard to our conceptions of American public opinion. So back to my original field. I think that civility and public opinion are connected, but I need your help in this because I'm not exactly sure how they're connected given the complexity of American discourse today. So first, to history. It looks like there is significant incivility all around us all the time, but compared to what? Historians have tried to remind us, great historians working on civility for many years, they tried to remind us without much success that incivility has been a constant in American life. We've always fought with each other. In the 18th century, in the days of our founding, incivility was pervasive. Some of it we like, they're fighting the British Crown and its abuses to establish a free nation, the original Tea Party. But we forget about the uglier side, the duels, nasty language, the mudslinging that was directed not toward England but toward each other. Take our founding fathers, not always models of dignity and civility, hardly. David McCullough writes in his terrific biography of John Adams, quote, Alexander Hamilton berated John Adams in nearly every possible way for his great, quote, his great intrinsic defects of character, his disgusting egotism, his weakness, vacillation, his eccentric tendencies. Hamilton did not go so far as to call Adams insane, but he cited his ungovernable temper as evidence of a man out of control. And this wasn't close to how ugly it could get. The 19th century saw very little improvement in civility, far from it. Americans argued in ways that demean themselves and each other. Often, as de Tocqueville, a very open-minded visitor from France, noted, we silenced each other through speech and intimidation. In fact, de Tocqueville, while traveling in the United States, the eastern United States, and a little bit into the Midwest, he fell in love with a lot of America and what he found mostly in the 1830s, 1840s. But he was very conscious of our flaws, in particular, our willingness to crush minority opinion with whatever we have. And it was de Tocqueville in the 1830s who coined the phrase tyranny of the majority, which you've heard many times. Here's a terrific dialogue from Tocqueville that he reports on in Democracy in America. That's his great 2-volume work published just before the Civil War. So I love this. And I think I put this in the speech when I had to give a talk at Franklin and Marshall. So Tocqueville writes, I said one day to an inhabitant of Pennsylvania, be so good as to explain to me how it happens that in a state founded by Quakers and celebrated for its toleration, freed blacks are not allowed to exercise civil rights. They pay the taxes. Is it not fair that they should have a vote? You insult us, replied my informant, if you imagine that our legislators could have committed so gross an act of injustice and intolerance. So Tocqueville says, what? Then blacks possess the right of voting in this country? Without the smallest doubt. Well, then Tocqueville says, how comes it then that at the polling booth this morning I did not perceive a single Negro in the entire meeting? This is not the fault of the law, his informant says. The Negroes have an undisputed right of voting, but they voluntarily abstained from making their appearance. A very pretty piece of modesty on their parts, rejoined I. The American replies back to Tocqueville, why, the truth is that they are not disinclined to vote, but they're afraid of being maltreated. In this country, the law is sometimes unable to maintain its authority without the support of the majority. But in this case, the majority entertains very strong prejudices against the blacks, and the magistrates are unable to protect them in the exercise of their legal privileges. And Tocqueville exclaims, what? Then the majority claims the right not only of making the laws, but of breaking the laws it made? And Tocqueville concludes, I do not say that tyrannical abuses frequently occur in America at the present day, but I maintain that no sure barrier is established against them, and that the causes which mitigate the government are to be found in the circumstances and the manners of the country more than in its laws. So put another way, and I love that dialogue. Put another way, the enforcement of any law relies on the circumstances of our political culture, our integrity, our civility. Tocqueville analyzed our inequalities and the tension over slavery and prejudice in non-slave states, but he could not have foreseen the dip in civility of the 1850s, which is, if I really were forced to pick the most uncivil period, it would probably have to be that. Brutal period in American social, political, intellectual history as we approach the Civil War, a horrendous war that would change the nation forever. We sustained a kind of level of incivility back then that makes cable news and even the most hateful blogs that we have look like child's play. So the book that Peter had, my book, Rude Democracy, it has a great lithograph on the cover from the 1850s. It's a beating on the floor of the Senate. There was Senator Sumner from Massachusetts gave an abolitionist speech in the Senate, and Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, actually came over from the House side, across Capitol Hill to the Senate, kind of stalked Sumner, and then tried to beat him to death with a cane on the floor of the Senate. And it's great. So Sumner had given the speech, and he had already given the speech, and he was sitting at his desk using his franking privileges, which is a way that your congressmen get to send you free mail. Mail, it doesn't cost them anything, because he thought the speech was so great. So he's sending it back to his constituents, and he was there, doing this stamping. And Brooks came over to try to kill him. But it's not the only incident of incivility in Congress. There were bench-clearing brawls. People pulled guns on each other, lots of fist fights. But that one is a particularly iconic moment in American history because it represents the depth of emotion about slavery and abolition, in addition to the kind of incivility that was normative, or at least in some parts of our politics at that point. It gives us a window into a range of acceptable behavior back then. Many people thought that beating of Senator Sumner was fair and justified. Well, it wasn't just his political view. He did make some ad hominem attacks against the Preston Brooks family members. So it was about honor as well, which in the South we take very seriously. But in the 18th and 19th century, people really did try hard to kill each other over honors, feuds, insults, and the like. So it makes us seem a little bit more civilized in the 21st century. And I don't mean to make incivility sound so ancient. It was with us, rolled with us into the 20th century from the 19th. Lynchings, a form of social action, justified as a form of social action up to the 1960s. There was incivility and often murder rooted in hate on the ground, north and south, but also in our political discourse. And FDR, for those of you who've studied the 20th century, was labeled a socialist, a fascist, all sorts of things. Reagan, a monster. George W. Bush, a village idiot, and so forth. Incivility is worrisome in a lot of ways, but made more difficult and more worrisome by the broadcast media, by the diffusion of the broadcast media. For example, and this is a place that I can talk about this easily, in the mid-20th century, two great social scientists, Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton, coined a term that a lot of the students here probably know, the narcotizing dysfunction effect of the mass media. They argued that too much exposure to media, and they were writing in the 1940s, so this was about radio, which is really astounding. Too much exposure to media can be debilitating politically. Listening to media, watching it, the constant political talk, they argued, leads to inaction and not to action. It does not inspire people to vote or get involved in politics or do much of anything. You start to replace doing with knowing. You think that you're acting because you know a lot about politics. So I had a neighbor in a neighborhood I used to live in, and our houses faced each other, so I could see in their kitchen all the time, and they could see in my kitchen. And they were older, and they watched CNN all day. And one day I was out in the yard, and I was talking to her, and she said, "I'm a political animal." But all they did all day was watch political news. But for them, that constituted being a political animal. And the political chatter around us is, I'd argue, in addition to what Lazarsfeld and Merton said, not only is it debilitating, but it makes you want to avoid politics, just like our students in the survey that we did back in Georgia. Okay, so political incivility, a constant in American politics, even though it takes different forms, manifests differently depending on type of media or period. Second, I said I'd defend incivility a little bit, or at least the balance of civility and incivility. So a few words on that. The fact that incivility has been present, has been a constant throughout, although with differing intensities throughout American history, it does make you wonder, don't people like it? Do people like it? They find it very useful. I'd argue, in fact, that civility, it's not a state or something you can measure in different periods, but more of a tool, a strategic asset that people use to get what they want. So the reason that you see so much negative advertising, for example, during campaigns, is that negativity works, gets out the vote, raises money, mobilizes people. I think I'll skip my Dick Morris quote. Sick of that. But I have argued in the book, less colorfully than Dick Morris did in my quote that I'm skipping, that if we think about incivility and civility as strategic weapons, and incivility in particular, it becomes less hurtful to us. If rudeness or trash talk is seen as just talk, one weapon in a whole repertoire of rhetorical weapons, isn't it less disturbing? Maybe we need a thicker skin in politics and not be so appalled and aghast at name-calling or insulting labels. If it is free speech, why do we find it so problematic when we can use our own free speech to defend ourselves, our positions, our fellow believers? When did we get so concerned with everybody's feelings in politics? When did we become so fragile with regard to free discourse? Are we a culture of delicate flowers with low self-esteem? Or are we a free, rough and tumble democracy, more like the founders had in mind? Going a little bit further, maybe incivility is attractive to us. It's always been part of American democracy. There must be something functional about it. I have this great colleague, some of you know him well, Rod Hart. He's at the University of Texas. And he's brilliant, and we think the same. I think he's brilliant because he and I are usually on the same wavelength, even when we haven't seen each other for a long time. But we were at a conference last summer, and we were on a panel about civility and incivility. And sure enough, Rod had a list of, we didn't even know he was working on this. He had outlined reasons why incivility interests us and why it attracts Americans and why it's so engaging and engrossing. So a couple of items from his list. Why is incivility always attractive to us? It's dramatic. We like drama in our lives. It's engaging. It's involving. It's dialectical. Incivility is typically two-sided. I mean, at least the way you see it on CNN, on the canceled Parker Spitzer, that kind of thing. Two-sided argument in a very complex, muddy world where there are really not two sides of anything. So incivility cleans things up a little bit. It's dramatic, it's two-sided, very engaging that way. Makes the world a little less complicated when it feels so chaotic. It's social, and that sounds weird because you think of incivility as very antisocial, but Hart says it's social because it connects us to people and ideas, and again, kind of engages our cognition in the world. My favorite, it is gentrified. It's violence arrested, hate gone middle class, which I think is really terrific. So he's got about 15 of these, and they're really very compelling when taken together. But I think he's trying to get at the same thing I am, only from a different direction. That there is something about incivility that's incredibly attractive and maybe inherent to at least our kind of democratic process. Third, I said I'd have some ideas, ways to reduce incivility if it is bothering you, or at least make it more tolerable in the sense of getting accustomed to it, or even getting practice in dealing with it. So what can we do? I have a few ideas in my book which feel so light and superficial, when I see Tom Goodnight sitting here, because one of the things I argue is that we need to teach argument, and I mean debate. And I'm an old high school debater, and Tom is some kind of debate genius, back from Northwestern. I think that colleges certainly can do more with teaching argumentation, maybe even requiring argumentation in classes. It can be done in middle schools and high schools, where you try to get students to take a side, take a stance, try to marshal evidence. Try to make claims, and get really comfortable with the idea of substantive political argument. It's not scary. It's actually fun. It's a huge amount of fun. And since I wrote the book, one of the really gratifying things about it, because it's more of a popular book, I don't think it's that scholarly, is that I have heard from a lot of teachers around the country who are trying just this, through internet resources, and some of them writing books and articles, trying to get argument to be part of, a standard part of K-12 curriculum, very early on. Again, to try to teach the next generations coming up, how to do argument well, not to avoid it, not to think it's uncomfortable, but how to do it in a productive fashion. So I make some statements about that. Also, using technology to teach it, to have online debates, video debates. Again, a lot of sophisticated people wrote into me about the projects they're working on along this line. Young people, all right, now I'm really on shaky ground, seem to have no problem with self-revelation on the internet. Maybe Facebook and different social networking projects, tools can be used to create a culture of debate, a culture of argument, through and across social networks. I realize that's not why people are using it, but it's possible that, as we train students in K-12 to try to, argue better, or at least learn, how it's done, then maybe it could be joined with technology, and social networks can be more than just about finding dates and doing whatever it is my kids are doing on Facebook. we need to develop a culture of listening too. You know, I talk a lot in the book, I write a lot in the book about a culture of argument, of debate. But we're not very good at listening, and we never have been as a democracy. This is the goal of, there's a lot of great projects out there on listening. You know, some of them more successful and widely known than others. One of them that you might have heard is the Npr Story Corps. I don't know if you've heard that. It's a big national project where they try to get people to come in and tell their stories, and then they tape them and they archive them in the Library of Congress. It's a terrific project, and it's mostly about developing a culture of exchange, of listening, and I think it's really wonderful, but it's the kind of thing that goes with a culture of argument. In the area of fixes, you know, for our, I won't say rising incivility, but the incivility that we have, and the way it's manifest and the way it's bothering us. I'm often asked about journalists and about pundits. No, let me get more specific. I'm usually asked about Glenn Beck. You know, does he represent a new, scarier than ever form of incivility? Are Glenn Beck and Fox News, or going the other way, the late Keith Olbermann, are they responsible for the quality of discourse? And in fact, are they to blame for kind of a rising or at least uncomfortable incivility as people see it? Maybe media, particularly the more excitable, flamboyant advocacy media, because none of those folks say that they're doing journalism. I mean, I think they know that they're advocating, play a part in furthering incivility. But you know, to my mind, it's a lot smaller role than we'd like to admit. You know, it's easy to blame them, but you know, the truth is that viewers, tens of millions of viewers, really enjoy this. You know, are tuning in regularly, and I think this says more about the nature of the citizenry and what we're like than what the media are like. Partisanship in the extreme, even if it doesn't represent where most Americans are. Most Americans are far more moderate than what's represented on television, and that's well known. Is engaging to people, and so is some incivility, going back to what Rod Hart was arguing. No one's forcing people to watch Glenn Beck or Keith Olbermann or choose your advocate. So I think we need to hold a mirror up to ourselves as citizens and figure out why are we attracted to this particular kind of discourse. Likely because there isn't much else on that's that entertaining. But it could also be that we've become so lazy, intellectually, politically, and shallow that we really do like people yelling at us and demanding our attention through this kind of the circus-like antics that you see in political talk these days. A lot depends on the journalist, the editor, the network. Some are clearly enabling civility, some enabling incivility. But we have very few models of real excellence with regard to constructive policy debate. And I was kind of hopeful about the Parker Spitzer CNN experiment, which has failed, because those are two smart people, and while they're on kind of different ends of the continuum, they're both fairly moderate. And I thought that might be something, but clearly that wasn't quite the right way to do it. But if we can integrate passionate debate into our media, television news, mainstream internet sites, even radio, an old-fashioned medium that still a huge number of people listen to, we'll be a better nation. There's nothing wrong with some incivility. It seems part of an inevitable part of heated debate. But we can learn to recognize it better, to critique it, to deal with it. And it's a structural matter, whether we do things like build debate into high school curricula or demand that media offer more substantive debate. But it's a cultural matter most of all. Do we really want to become a nation based on civility, on substantive argument? If so, we have to force a higher level of sophistication in political argument, toughen up at the same time, learn to live with some incivility and negativity, but not be blinded by it, and keep pressing for real substantive debate. It's possible, it's ideal. It would certainly be much more consistent with what the founders had in mind when they established the nation, but it's why they could likely threaten duels and do their mudslinging, but somehow, at the very same time they were doing that, create a real democracy with all its warts. So finally, the relationship of civility debates to the more scholarly conundrums of public opinion. Okay, now I'm just trying this out on you, so I'm very open-minded. All right, but incivility it was always with us. We know that. Historians have documented it, very nicely. Layer on this the emergence of the internet, which, among other things, reveals the true chaos and incoherence that is American public opinion in ways that astound us, does it not? I'd argue that public opinion, a coherent thing that you can measure, never existed. And neither really did political civility exist. Both are reifications of a classic sort. We talk about them as if they existed when they simply may have been hopes, more like fictions that we've leaned on for our comfort and our simplicity, making a harsh world, a harsh, complicated world, a little more simple, a little more easy to understand. That public opinion is a reification, a kind of unreal entity that we make concrete through rhetoric. Not a new idea at all. I didn't think of it, even though I thought of it at Annenberg. But it turns out that Herbert Blumer thought of it in the 1940s, and then Pierre Bourdieu elaborated on it beautifully in the 1970s and in a way that I think is never surpassed. But despite their claims, politicians still throw around the phrase public opinion all the time, like they were talking about a chair or a table or something pretty solid. We measure it, even if it's squishy, and the poll numbers have to be measuring something, don't they? Now, as you know, this notion that public opinion doesn't exist and it only exists through measurement or through talk, through rhetoric, it's a hard thing to swallow in social science. And I was paying attention in 700 A and B. I still consider myself a social scientist, which is why Blumer and Bourdieu are largely ignored, particularly in political science and opinion research. Too scary. Too many careers are built on survey research. That's my general theory about this. Conveniently, Phil Converse, longtime opinion scholar at Michigan, pronounced Blumer and all who questioned polling dead back in 1986. It was a special supplement to Public Opinion Quarterly. So a lot of people don't have to read it anymore because of that. I think Converse, who's a great scholar, but could not have been more wrong or more blind on this topic at least. The lack of a coherent public opinion is now clear to us. It's clear as day. The internet reveals it every single minute. There are a lot of opinions out there, and there are a lot of different frames for issues, and there are a lot of different kinds of intensity, and maybe it's constantly in flux. It's hard to measure, absolutely, maybe even impossible. Put another way, Blumer and Bourdieu, I think they have won after all. I think that their arguments about public opinion being a reification, maybe not existing, are stronger than ever. Of course, individual people have opinions, and sometimes they match in a given moment. But it's pretty audacious and really wild, for Sarah Palin or Barack Obama or Eric Cantor to characterize public opinion in anything but general directional terms, such as we all fear Al-Qaeda or we believe in freedom, those kind of things, which are supportable. So sorry to sound like an anarchist or postmodernist or whatever I am. I'm not any of those. But I think that media have made the vast complexity of human sentiment very obvious, and as a side effect, have revealed the incivility that has always been with us as well. I hope that makes sense. I've been overly harsh to try to make a point about the conflation of public opinion as we now see it revealed before us and incivility. So thanks so much for listening, and look forward to your questions and your ideas, and you can tell me if it made any sense. So grateful to be here.
It seems to me that the argument we should sort of accept incivility because historically it's always been a part of our experience, is troubled in a sense by the notion that if we're really going to move toward real deliberation, what we need to coach is a respect for the force of the better argument. And respect for the force of a better argument means a willingness to listen to the others so we can see whether or not we've in fact been proven wrong. Mm-hmm. And if we lose that ability, then then we do get literally people living in echo chambers and shouting at each other. Any thoughts on that? How we coach the notion that it makes sense to listen and not just speak?
I really, maybe it's my narrow training as a high school debater, but I really did keep coming back to, a kind of a rule-governed, approach to this, where you do start to teach, kids, just like they learn all kinds of other, ways to think in elementary school and middle school. They could also be made to understand or led to understand how it is that you make arguments, marshal evidence, how you listen, teach tolerance. And, I actually think it's as important, when you think about, building democracy, improving democracy, as teaching math or science or English. I think it's that critical. I don't know how else you can get change. We can't just hope for cohort change or generation. For us, it's too late. We are what we are. But I think it's and all political science books end like this. By the way, that we always put it back on K to 12. Somebody should do something about this. But I think in this case, it could conceivably work. And I know the debate people will support me. Yeah.
With regard to the Georgia survey, the students feeling a reticence to debate, to have a conversation with each other about these political topics. Do you feel that that has something to do with a perception of civility, or is it possible that it has something to do with lack of knowledge? If someone is well informed about a particular topic, do you think they have a propensity to seek out?
Oh, wait, just one second. So if you go back just a sentence or two. So maybe it's not about civility, it's about knowledge.
Yeah. With the students, I'm thinking that is it perhaps they're not informed, and that's why they don't want to discuss various topics, or do you think it has something to do with their perception of civility and they want to maintain politeness and they don't want to get into it?
Yeah, well, I think it's the latter, because we didn't really study their knowledge levels. That would have been a kind of a different project. But because it was an internet survey, students they just wrote a huge amount, and so the qualitative data were definitely the most interesting part of the project. And the most amazing thing about these data were how incredibly well informed the students were. It was during the first wave was during the long primary between Obama and Clinton. When was that? But it went on a long. So the data collection was during that, and then I think after in Obama's first year, I think it was that next spring that we did the next wave. But the students they wrote beautifully. They knew what was going on. They knew how they felt. They understood a lot of the issues, but they didn't really want to talk about them with each other. There were many, there is kind of gruesome data to go through because, they told stories about arguments they'd had on campus and, how upsetting it had been, about political activity that they'd tried to initiate, putting up signs, raising money, that kind of thing for candidates, and, how they were treated by students who were not like-minded. Nasty comments on the quad. It was really kind of, for a university administrator, it was kind of heartbreaking, especially because, those were our campuses. And all the way from, tiny little schools in North or South Georgia to big research universities, in major cities. So I don't think it's about whether they were informed or knowledgeable. I do think it's about this fear of getting in over their heads in some kind of passionate debate that they couldn't handle somehow, and that it would end poorly. So not just in the Neumann sense of they'd be socially isolated. It was scarier than that to them, and it was stepped up some notches.
In the book, you toy with a theme that you didn't this afternoon, but I'm interested if you be willing to enlarge on it, and that is whether some of this aversion stems from our having become kind of a therapeutic culture, that the constant presence of the Dr. Phils in the media seems to project to us culturally that we should always feel okay, and we should always feel an equipoise, a sense of serenity about our life, and that argument violates that, and that is the source of anxiety.
Yeah, and you put it so well. You put it maybe better than my equipoise. No, it's well put, and I do believe that we want to feel good all the time. And if we're feeling discomfort, it means we need therapy, or it has to get solved somehow. That we can't. Yeah, it has to get resolved. We can't live with discomfort. We can't live with ambiguity. Hence my chapter on Sarah Palin. Which I've got. I mean, that's the thing that people react to most in this book, because I try to be even-handed about her, and I think I am. But she does, among all the interesting things that she did rhetorically during the campaign, at least, she's a lot of it was about discomfort, on the part of the journalists who reported on her, and I think they did a very poor job in general. There was very little comparative, to show her rallies and what she said and did, but never kind of compared to what were the other candidates doing. I mean, she always stood alone as a force for, fascination and discomfort, all wrapped up in an attractive woman. So it's a really interesting morass. I mean, I don't know what's gonna become, what her next act is. And it should be interesting to watch. But she is like so many women rhetors, before her. And you can name her. As a matter of fact, one of the reviewers for the book was extremely mad that, the chapter wasn't about Hillary Clinton. Because, she was out there first. I'm like, no, Eleanor Roosevelt was out there first. No, wait, it goes back to the 19th century and, various women speakers, leaders who made people feel uncomfortable. So I think that's part of it, and especially with young people today who are not, they're not wild about the rough and tumble part. Yeah.
Yeah. When I received your book, it was the week of the Arizona shootings. Just coincidentally enough, and I was wondering if you had reflections on that moment or others where there's disruption. What needs to happen, or what are expectations set in place, or how could it be addressed better or worse?
Well, I guess I put, I bracket that I don't think that was about incivility, but everything else that happened afterward was about incivility, especially among the commentators, and the immediate beginning, the blame game about what caused this. And what I thought was really interesting about it was they were looking for a lot of what caused it in political discourse, and so it was, for you rhetoricians, is a very fascinating moment. So, I don't know. I mean, I guess I go back to the generational argument or the cohort argument. If we can teach people how to argue more effectively, then after an incident like that, I mean, maybe we could actually, discuss it instead of the immediate games that started up with, Fox News and MSNBC, and just, trying to piece it together, through ideological lenses instead of, trying to figure out what happened. And, and in this case, I mean, it is it was an unbalanced person. And so that kind of adds an element of, not so much about politics, but about just, this one, person with severe mental illness. So I don't know what to do with Arizona, but I do see that right afterward, people had no analytic tools, no ways to discuss it that were productive. So that I did notice. And I think because of that, it's faded. People are interested in the Congresswoman and her survival, and the and the assailant and the victims, and that sort of thing. But I don't think people know what to do with it, in culture, because we don't know how to argue about it. So it just sits there as a kind of a oddity. I mean, disturbing, but yeah.
Old-fashioned as I am, I suspect that civility has something to do with respecting the dignity and worth of another person. So the reluctance of students to argue is a challenge to losing their sense of dignity and worth by being told they're not smart or they don't know enough and so on. Dr. Phil is very happy ensuring everybody's sense of dignity and worth. Okay? So it works that way. You have a shooting in Arizona, who has any dignity and worth left that can be traded, that people can rely on? I understand a little bit about what you were saying. Civility can be strategic, incivility can be strategic. But I wonder about dignity and worth of people.
I don't know. I mean, it's it's not something I've thought a lot about. It's not something I wrote about in a book. I mean, I guess from my standpoint, I'm just I'm not taking a stance on that. So I don't know. Does anybody have any ideas about that way of looking at it? I do. Reading through all these, just hundreds of thousands of student comments in the survey. There was a lot of heart in there. I mean, and the students, I mean, what I, again, found painful as an administrator is, they wanted to interact with each other. They just had no idea how to do it, given that they, had strong, ideological feelings on either side. So there wasn't a lot of, those people are bad and I don't like to talk to them. I mean, it was more like, I don't agree with those people and they scare me. And, I wish there was a way to talk with them. And I, in general, find college students to be very good-natured still, after all these years, and very respectful. My gosh, in the South, they're really respectful. I mean, I'm going to miss that, the ma'am, yes, ma'am, all the time. But it's an excellent point, and I think it is. It's part of this. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the discussion, and one of the things I noticed in the book, and the same theme about how we improve, you talked about the civic education and younger, and kind of where that conversation starts. And I was curious, given your new position, the efforts we've had in Los Angeles to reintroduce argumentation and debate in high school, one of the pushbacks, as they say, but the other half of your university wants us to teach the standardization, and so we've squeezed out the life of the mind for the life of the evaluation tool. And I was curious if you had any thoughts about how kind of balancing that relationship between the role of the university to promote the values on one side, but then what the pressures that the schools are facing on the other.
Yeah, that's a great point. I just mentioned it in passing in the book. And it's funny. I mean, the only teachers who have written to me are the ones who agree with me. But I'm sure most teachers would say, if they were forced to read my book, that there's just no time in the day for it. I mean, what's going to give then? And I think that's a huge, structural issue. Right now, my kids go to a private school. They have tremendous freedom. I mean, they're doing all kinds of, cool things with the curriculum because they can. In a public school where there is testing, there's pressure, on schools to have the students perform well. I mean, it's a serious matter. But again, the teachers that wrote to me say that there are a lot of possibilities. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities to embed the teaching of debate into the kind of the standard American history curriculum they have to do, or even some of the scientific curriculum, and certainly literature and that sort of thing. So got some very creative, sophisticated people thinking about this out there. They just don't have much of a platform, and so I'm looking forward to seeing how their experiments start to get applied. Yeah.
You talked a few times about how both youth and adults have a lot of knowledge about politics but don't necessarily act on it. And so when you talk a lot about incivility, I feel like there's this pairing concept of uncivility, perhaps. And so I'm wondering if you can make a judgment about which one is perhaps worse, be it actual political action in a negative light or no political action at all. So for example, the Jon Stewart rally was a perfect opportunity that brought thousands of students out to Washington, D.C., but inherently it was uncivil in that it created no action, even though it had the opportunity to engage. So which do you think is worse or better, or could you just make a value judgment on
Yeah, I'm with the kind of the Saul Alinsky crowd, I think, or the Herbert Marcuse crowd, or and there are many right wing leaders right now who are using Alinsky. And these kind of, he was a great organizer, labor organizer in Chicago in the 50s and the 60s, and he wrote these great books like Rules for Radicals and how you disrupt meetings and how you get things done, politically in your town, in your city, in your state. And his argument is that there's going to be incivility, and there's going to be disruption, and just have a thicker skin about it. You do have to listen. There are instances where disruption is not appropriate, but there's an awful lot of room for passion and disruption, and even what looks like incivility in constructive political action. So does that make sense?
Yes. Do you feel though like the fact that people are being incivil is better than them being?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like this, yeah. So better to have passionate, engaged incivility, or everyone's really nice to each other and but not politically engaged or politically knowledgeable. And I take the former. And I do think, if I could speak for the founding fathers, I do think that's what they had in mind. That's what they practiced with each other. It could be brutal, but they thought that's how social change happens. That's how institutions are formed, and that's how people, figure out how to get along with each other, in a world where there are differing opinions. Yeah.
So this is kind of two-parter. So, first of all, obviously America? Do you feel that there's kind of a specific American brand or style of incivility? Obviously, incivility, it takes place all over the world, but due to the specific political or cultural nature of America, that it takes on a specific form here. And second of all, I'm speaking from a Canadian perspective, and we get tons of American media and content north of the border. So do you feel that if there is a specific type of American incivility, is there a potential that it's obviously American media goes all around the world. Does it play an effect in other areas, either as kind of exporting it or creating a backlash in that we don't want to be like the Americans, so let's do stuff a different way? I know it's a bit beyond the scope of your work.
Well, it's beyond the scope of me as a person because I'm so provincially American politics. I do no comparative work whatsoever. Never have. I hope to, someday. But so I'm not sure. I'm not sure how our current. It seems idiosyncratic because of of who we are, of our uniqueness. But I imagine that's true for a lot of other nations as well. Back when I was in Annenberg and we would talk about cross different kinds of political discourse across. Israel was held up a lot of times as an example, or Italy, of places where there is there's very passionate discourse, a lot of engagement, and some tolerance of incivility, and that they were ahead of us in their ability to argue with each other in a kind of more constructive, passionate way. I don't know if that was really the case. I don't know if it's the case now. Are we exporting incivility in our political media? I don't know. That's a great dissertation topic. It's like, how many years into it are you? That would be fabulous. And I have, I've read a lot of the civility and incivility literature, and the best stuff is by the historians. There's not a huge amount of comparative work, and the historians are like anybody else. So that, they specialize by country, so they're typically not equipped either to go very broad. And you won't find this kind of work in comparative politics and political science. You just won't find it. So it's a great topic.
Let me ask you a quick
Uh-oh.
question and one have a quick answer. But some of the people sitting here are in a class in which we're talking a lot about sort of classic ways of looking at communication. And one of the points that we're sort of keep coming back to is that there was a whole body of knowledge that was built up over decades. You know, you and I have been part of that over the decades. But in a certain way, the current situation, particularly with the internet, puts all of that back into question and sort of reopens the closed questions. And it would seem to me that public opinion would be one of those things where, you know, we sort of knew, or these people said they sort of knew how it all worked. You know, and quick ideas of how that has been reopened by the technological changes that we.
It has. I mean, I feel like polls and surveys are going to be. I feel like they're almost meaningless right now in political discourse. I mean, there are so many interesting ways that people can express themselves, and I mean, for crying out loud, on CNN, Don Lemon, these people, they're reading people's tweets. I mean, the first time I saw that was very strange. Obviously, it tests well. They find that people like that he reads their tweets, even if it's not their tweet. They apparently are interested in other people's tweets, and that's some crazy stuff. I mean, that's something in public opinion research that we did not expect, just how interesting, varied, colorful it will be. I mean, I'm not saying that it's an advance. I mean, maybe it was better when we had just a few gatekeepers who knew how to do sample surveys in a scientific way. Maybe, I don't know. I guess, time will tell, but I do feel like most of the literature in public opinion, it's pretty shaky because of this technological change. And again, I think that Bourdieu, Bloomer, those guys were they were onto something.
Well, let me just point out then, part of this has been an explanation or a demonstration of how much exciting work there is to do. And how we don't know everything, even though Susan's demonstrated how much some of us do know. Join me in thanking Susan.